Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. Always a pleasure to be learning together. This class is part of Safir Azman at Risha. This is the third session of Law and Practice in Early Judaism with Dr. Malka Z. Simkovich. Again, just a reminder on how we run the class. Some of you who are trickling in will get an invitation to become a panelist. If you accept the invitation, it would allow you to unmute and speak, make comments, ask questions, and also show us your face if you wish. You can also choose to keep your video off if needed. Just please stay muted when you're not actively speaking. I will also help mute you as needed so we don't have background noise, but that means that you also need to remember to unmute when you do want to make comments or questions. You can also engage in writing here in the chat if you're with us on Zoom, or you can make a comment on Facebook if you are watching us live. Welcome to you as well, everyone on Facebook. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Dr. Simkovich.
Thank you very much, and good to see everybody. Just a little note, I don't check the comments on Facebook, but maybe you can share them.
Yeah, I will relay the messages from Facebook.
Perfect. And also, I often don't see comments in the Zoom chat, but again, feel free to cut in and share your questions and comments. We're a really small group, and especially if you have a clarity related question that you don't want to hold on to until the end of the hour, don't hesitate. It's good to see all of you. I'm joining from my work office at Catholic Theological Union in South Chicago, so I'm in a little bit of a different space than usual. For those of you who joined us last week and the week before, you'll remember that we've been talking about common Judaism. And common Judaism is what the vast majority of Jews in the ancient world observed. These are the three identifying markers of Jewish practice: Shabbat, and you might say calendar if you wanted to expand it, but it's really Shabbat, Brit Milah, and dietary laws. These are the things that wherever you were, you could identify yourself to your neighbors and to other Jews by observing these practices. I'm just trying to change the format. Is there a way to use the gallery view? Hold on one second.
Oh, sure. Yeah. You can either switch it. I just wanted to spotlight you, but if you go to a view at the top right.
I did that, but now it says I can't move myself because I'm spotlighted.
Okay, do you want me to remove the spotlight?
Yeah, that way I could see everybody. Thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Thanks. Okay.
Sorry about that. Is this better?
Yeah, perfect. Now I can move myself away and I can see everybody. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so because these practices were distinctive, the Jews very early on in the 3rd or 2nd century BC were subject to active critique by Egyptians, Greeks, and later Romans, who accused the Jews of being separatists, insular, barbaroi, that means foreigners in Greek, misanthropic. But these are the three main identifying markers for the vast majority of Jews. Now, for Jewish sectarians, there's actually a slightly different formulation of what the main markers of Jewish practice were. Instead of Shabbat, dietary law, and circumcision being the main identifying markers of Jewish practice, there's a general broad emphasis on maintaining purity of the individual, purity of the community, and purity pervades all aspects of one's day-to-day life. And it pervades three main legal categories. Again, Shabbat is one of those categories. Food is one of those categories, but it goes beyond what one does in their kitchen. It impacts tithing laws. It impacts what kinds of food, again, you bring to the temple. And the third category is cultic practice at the temple. So instead of thinking about these three main identifying markers as being Shabbat, dietary law, and circumcision, I would posit there are three different categories in the world of the sectarians, and that's Shabbat, food, and temple. And all of these things are interconnected and overlapping, as we'll see. They all comprise a broader system of purity. Now, before I go on to say a little bit more about how purity operates in these sectarian communities, I want to emphasize something that I often say in my Jerisha classes, which is we cannot overestimate the, you're going to think I'm saying that when someone says I can't overestimate the importance of it, means that they are saying something's important. I'm saying the opposite. I am worried about overestimating the importance of sectarian influence. In other words, we love to talk about the Pharisees. We love to talk about the Dead Sea sect because they're interesting, because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've got 900 distinct documents from the Dead Sea libraries. And so sometimes we assume that their communities reflect a kind of broad mainstream, a worldview that was very common. And I want to do the opposite. The reason why I saved this class on sectarian law for the third class and not the second is that we have to keep in mind there were very few sectarians. So they're interesting. We have a lot of literature about them, but there are very few of them. There's maybe 6,000 Pharisees, 3,000 Sadducees, and 4,000 Essenes. These are estimates. No one is going around taking a census of who's a sectarian and who isn't, but these are the numbers that Josephus gives us, and Josephus is known to inflate his numbers. So we really don't know how many sectarians there were. We know that they were broadly limited to Judea, to the land of Israel, maybe to Galilee, to the north. It's possible that there were some sectarians in Egypt because the early first century CE philosopher Philo talks about a group of Jews called the Therapeutae who go off into the wilderness. They leave the hustle and bustle of city life. The Therapeutae live in the wilderness, out of the suburbs and beyond of Alexandria. They spend all week in seclusion studying Torah and philosophy. They only come together on Shabbat to share Divrei Torah and their chidushim, their new ideas that put philosophy and Torah into conversation. This is a fascinating community, but according to the classical understanding of what a sect is, the Therapeutae are not a sect. Because according to most scholars, such as Al Baumgarten at Hebrew U and others, part of the definitional feature of a sect is that they believe that only those within the sect are the true Israel and observing laws in a way that reflects the proper divine will. The Therapeutae probably did not reject the legitimacy of everybody outside their community. They were just people who wanted to devote their lives to study, and they probably had a good deal of economic privilege and independence because they had the opportunity to do so. Most people did not have the privilege of being able to just go out into the wilderness and just, put a pause on life and learn all day. It's kind of like the Kola life, maybe. But I don't think that the Therapeutae are a sect. I think that the sect is really a Judean phenomenon that comes out of the political chaos of the early 2nd century BCE, when the Hasmoneans are rebelling against the Syrian Greeks. And there's a lot of internal debate among Jews about the extent to which the Jews should resist the influence of Syrian Greek rule. And out of this, we find a culture in which there are all these communities breaking off from one another. And these are the sectarians. Again, these are small groups, at least in the beginning. And these groups, especially the Pharisees and the Essenes, are profoundly concerned with purity and how purity impacts Shabbat, food, and temple. So it's a little different of a scheme than what we've been discussing up until now in our first and second classes. So now I want to say a little bit about purity, and we're not going to take a deep dive because you could do a whole course on purity. And I do want to recommend a fantastic scholar who has written a new book and has written many, many things on purity. And that's my friend Yair Furstenberg. Anybody know Yair Furstenberg at Hebrew U? Yair is amazing. So this book, which is actually not so new, but it is new in English, it was just translated maybe a year ago, Purity and Identity in Ancient Judaism. And he has a lot of new arguments, maybe a little bit against the grain, but Yair Furstenberg has an advantage that many scholars don't have, which is that he has facility not only in Hebrew and Aramaic, and he's very familiar with the rabbinic tradition, but he also has a very good command of Greek. So he's looking at the New Testament and he's looking at Jesus's conversations with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. and putting these into conversation with later rabbinic sources that engage with questions of purity. And so he's able to really widen the scope of what it looked like to be a sectarian in the first century. I'm not going to type into the chat now, but I'm going to repeat the title. And then when we leave time for questions at the end, I'm happy to type. It's called Purity and Identity in Ancient Judaism. The author is Yair Furstenberg, F-U-R-S-T. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a little bit of a rundown of the scholarly assessment, and then we'll look at some sources. First of all, it is incredibly difficult and maybe impossible to really know what the Pharisees have to say about purity. Anybody want to venture a guess as to why? You could just unmute. Why do we have no idea, really?
They didn't write anything down?
Yeah, exactly. We don't have the Pharisees' writings, which is kind of a surprise because we love to talk about the Pharisees, right? They're the antecedents to the rabbis. According to Josephus, they are the most popular of the sects. They are teachers. They are respected by the masses, and yet we don't have Pharisaic writings. And that's why someone like Yair, I should say Dr. Furstenberg, has to look at the New Testament, the later Mishnah, right, which isn't contemporaneous with the Pharisees, but comes after them, and it's drawing from non-Pharisaic documents, many of which are produced by their opponents. It's never a good idea to learn about a group based on what your opponent has to say about you, but that's what scholars have to do. So we cobble information together from these various sources, including the Dead Sea Library, which cites legal material that reflects the opponents of the Dead Sea sect. And scholars think, even though the Pharisees aren't named in these legal texts, scholars kind of map these onto the Pharisees. So this is all conjectural work. And that is why scholars debate over the question of how the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Sadducees build a worldview that's based on purity. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of what this scholarly debate is about. And I'll just divide it into kind of two schools. There's the opinion of Christine Hayes at Yale University and Dr. Yair Furstenberg. And so there's a general question of like, what are these people disagreeing over when it comes to purity? And Christine Hayes will say the question is about realism, right? The sect at the Dead Sea, they were probably Essenes. They believed that purity was this real, tangible force that exists in the world, that has control over us, and there are forces of purity and impurity that we have to navigate as we move through the world and try to combat. And so it's a real ontological status. Whereas the Pharisees, over time, by the time you get into the rabbinic period, they don't believe necessarily that purity and impurity is an ontological, real internal status, but it's an idea that you're working with in order to sort of produce a life of sanctity. This is kind of like an abstract debate, but this is how Chris Hayes views it. It's really a question of like, is this real, or is it something that we're using in order to produce a life of discipline, devotion, piety? And Furstenberg says, no, everybody thinks purity is real. The Pharisees are not being like, this is a fake thing, we're just sort of going through the play acting. According to Furstenberg, all the sects are realists when it comes to purity, but what they're debating over is the extent to which people, and specifically the rabbis, have personal agency that allows them to name something as being pure and impure. So to the extent to which someone has power over these forces of purity and impurity is the debate. And the Pharisees empower themselves, the individual, to assess. So purity is coming from within. It's not something that's an external force acted upon us, but that we can determine based on a certain set of criteria whether something is pure and impure. Anyway, this might sound like a very abstract debate, but the point that I want to share is simply that this is an open question. The question of what is at the core of these worldviews when it comes to purity is not something that enjoys scholarly consensus. Again, for our purposes, we're going to talk about purity as a worldview that encompasses legal categories, specifically Shabbat calendar, right? That's one thing. Food-related laws like diet and tithing, that's another thing, and temple practice. So those are the three categories, again, as opposed to common Judaism, where your average Jew is observing Shabbat dietary law, and circumcision. Those are the three identifying markers of Jewish practice, I would say, outside of these purity concerned communities. All right, so again, we have very limited time. We're going to do what we can. I have a very long source sheet. Don't get overwhelmed by the source sheet. Are there any questions before we take a look at Josephus? All right, so we'll just dive in. It's a little tricky, the question of how to organize these sources, because Josephus is at the tail end of the Second Temple period. So at first I thought maybe I should go in chronological order. We'll look at the Dead Sea literature, which comes from the 2nd and 1st century BCE, but it's really not useful in this case to be chronological because we want to get a big picture view. And then if we have time, we'll home in. So I want to start with Josephus because Josephus gives us a broad picture of sectarian life in the ancient world. He's writing after the temple falls. He's writing the 90s CE. Have we talked a little bit about Josephus? I think that I've referenced him in earlier classes. And he talks about 3 major sects, except in his 7-volume work, The Jewish War, which recounts the circumstances in which the Jews rebel against the Roman Empire in 66 CE. There he talks about a 4th sect, and that's the Zealots. But the Zealots are really a political group of extremists that actually come out of maybe Pharisees or other sectarian groups. So I'm putting the Zealots aside as a political group. We're talking about 3 main groups that are deeply concerned with purity as a category. And those, of course, are the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Sadducees. And I'll say one more thing. We'll discuss this a little bit more when we look at the Dead Sea literature. The main concern especially with the Essenes is producing or manipulating a reality in which one is as separated as possible from forces of impurity. And in order to achieve that reality, you have to be extremely stringent about certain separations. So purity means to be properly separate from certain things, whether it's certain kinds of foods or whether it's people like non-Jews. It's about avoiding certain kinds of mixtures, and we're going to see that come up in various sources. But for now, let's look at Josephus. Any questions before I share my screen? Okay. All right. So yes.
Joyce, would you like me to ask the question now, or do you prefer to keep it for the end?
The end.
Oh, I'm
The end.
sorry.
Okay.
I didn't see that. Okay,
Sounds
fine.
good.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question, Joyce. And it happens in the early rabbinic period. It doesn't happen at even like by the end of the 1st century. There's still a pretty small group, but Josephus says they're very popular as teachers, right? So it's like having a teachers union. You might not have a lot of people in the union, but everybody knows about it, that kind of thing. But we could talk about it more. All right. So now take a look at what Josephus says in the 13th book of his 20-volume work, his History of the Jews, Antiquities of the Jews. And he embeds his descriptions of the sectarian communities in broader overviews of certain historical events. So in book 13 and 17, he's reviewing the late Second Temple period. I think in 13, he's starting to get into the Hasmonean era. And these are just digressions as he's referring to various people who were rulers at this time. These are various digressions in Josephus's work. So he says, what I would now explain is this. The Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses. Now, we did talk about this in the first class, which is the question of whether there is a category of oral law that Jews are thinking with in the Second Temple period. And we talked about how to think about this category. But I noted that the category of oral and written law are really categories that derive out of the Pharisaic community, even though Jews are producing interpretations and they're transmitting ideas and scriptural texts orally, not text, but scriptural, I don't know how to say it, scriptural verses, but they're sharing them orally and they're also interpreting. But the notion of an oral and written law, these are associated with the Pharisees. So they are keeping things that are not written in the Torah. So the Greek of law is nomos, and nomos is actually the word for Torah that Jews use. So this was really written in the Torah. For that reason, the Sadducees reject them, because the Sadducees do not accept the notion that there is anything authoritative about an unwritten or oral law. If it's not in the Torah, it's not authoritative. That's what the Sadducees say. The Sadducees say we're to esteem those observances that are only in the Torah, and are not to observe what is derived from the tradition of our forefathers, because that's, for the Sadducees, is too speculative. Anybody could walk around saying, oh, I only eat pumpernickel and rye bread because that is what my father told me came from Moses at Sinai. And the Sadducees say, no, this is too unstable. This is too speculative. You're empowering yourselves to such a degree that we reject this. And therefore, because they reject the claim to a category of oral law, there are great disputes and differences that have arisen between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But here, and this is something I just mentioned to Joyce, the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich. They're actually associated with the priesthood, with the social elite. They are making ties. We have some sources that they're making ties with the Roman elite in the 1st century BCE. But the Pharisees are of the people, right? They're not born into priesthood. They're kind of built on a meritocracy, right? Anybody can be a Pharisee if you learn enough Torah, if you sit at the feet of a teacher, right? I mean, that's like what the famous Mishnah Avot tells us, that you have to acquire for yourself a teacher, or make for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend. And the Pharisees have the multitude on their side, because I think they're more relatable. Right? You can relate to a Pharisee because you yourself, if you learned enough and you are a man, you could be a Pharisee. So about these two sects and that of the Essenes, I've treated elsewhere in the 2nd book of Jewish Affairs. So I think he's talking about the Jewish War. So this is just an aside where he defines these sectarian groups, especially the Pharisees and the Sadducees, according to whether they accept a category of oral law as authoritative. Now, later in Antiquities, this is what is very odd, is that Josephus offers, and also in the Jewish War, he offers different definitions of the sects and different reasons for why they are distinct. This is what he says in book 17. There was a certain sect of men that were Jews. They valued themselves highly upon the exact skill they had in the law of their fathers. So again, these are Pharisees who believe and take pride in the fact that they've received this oral tradition from their fathers, and they made these men believe that they were highly favored. And in this passage, Josephus is quite critical of the Pharisees. This isn't the only passage where Josephus criticizes their sense of maybe intellectual and religious superiority. These men are called the Pharisees. They were in a capacity of greatly opposing kings. In other words, they support the rebellion against Rome in the 1st century. So when all the people, the Jews, gave assurance of their goodwill to Caesar, these men did not swear. In other words, when the rebellion starts to brew in the middle of the 1st century CE or even earlier, one of the first things that happens is that there are Jews, including Pharisees, who refuse to offer the daily sacrifice on behalf of the welfare of the emperor. And according to Josephus, the cessation of that sacrifice that was meant to ask God to protect the emperor, the cessation of that was a sign, one of the early signs of rebellion, and the Pharisees were involved in that. And how many are there? Just above 6,000, Josephus tells us. Okay. Now, in the Jewish War, this is really interesting, I think. In the Jewish War, Josephus, you see how long this is, goes on and on and on about the Essenes. Now, it's interesting because if you read the New Testament, you'll see the Essenes don't really feature. They're not, I don't even know if they're mentioned in the New Testament. I mean, I'd have to check. But Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These groups are talking to each other as well. We've got Mishnaic references to them, and they seem to be in close collaboration and legal debate. The Essenes are kind of doing their own thing. Both Josephus, who's reared in Judea, but then he's writing in Rome after the war, and Philo, who's reared in Alexandria, love the Essenes. And this might surprise you because the Essenes are kind of this ascetic group who are maybe a little antisocial, extremely pious when it comes to purity laws. Maybe some might even consider them to be a little protective, private, insular. And yet Josephus and Philo adore the Essenes. It's a little counterintuitive. Now, one of the reasons, and we'll look at the source in a minute, one of the reasons why Josephus absolutely respects them is because they have an ethos that was widely admired in the Hellenistic world. And that is the ethos of common living. What do I mean by common living? Kind of, I don't know if anyone's ever read the book of Acts in the New Testament, but this is how, and I think Acts chapter 4 at the beginning, the community of disciples is described as common living. It means you don't own goods, you share everything, you live in community. It's basically a kibbutz. And this idea was considered to be this sort of anti-market, I guess, attitude was considered to be extremely humble and very pietistic. So let's look at what Josephus says about the Essenes and look especially for legal material, because we're going to look, if we have a little bit of time, we're going to look at some Dead Sea texts about how the sect lived. And most scholars believe that the sect at the Dead Sea were an extreme version of the Essenes. So all the Essenes are quite observant, especially when it comes to purity law, but some Essenes are extremely, extremely stringent, and that was probably the Dead Sea sect. So let's just dive in. Okay, there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews, and philosophia is a Greek word. So Josephus is clearly making a polemic here. He wants his readers to admire these groups as philosophies, and he actually compares the Pharisees, I think, to the Epicureans at one point, and he compares the Essenes, I think, to the Pythagoreans. So he's like this is not subtle. Like these are philosophies, right? He's arguing for the integrity of these sects. Okay. The followers of the first of whom are the Pharisees and then the Sadducees, and the third sect who pretends to a severer discipline, they're called the Essenes. Great. These last Jews, the Essenes, are Jews by birth, and they have a greater affection for one another than the other sects. Remember, he says the Sadducees and the Pharisees bicker with each other. Well, not so with the Essenes. They have an affection for each other. They reject the pleasures as an evil. They esteem continence. They have conquest over virtue. In other words, they're not Pythagoreans and they're not Epicureans, they're Stoics. They're totally controlling their emotions. And by the way, I just want to jump ahead and say, why is he going on and on and on and on about this? I think that Josephus presumes that his readers, both Romans and Jews, he's writing for both, do not have personal contact with this group because they're more isolated. So he has to explain them, right? It's like if I say to you, oh, like, do you know the, I'm so bad with metaphors, but some like Native American tribe that you've never heard of, like you'd want some context, you'd want some more information than if I were to say, oh, did you ever go to that Hadar event in New York City? Well, Hadar, I don't have to like define Hadar for you. I'm bad with metaphors. You get the point. All right. These Essenes, they neglect wedlock. Now, elsewhere, Josephus says that they do get married. So here he's talking about some Essenes, scholars think, because Josephus is contradictory. But here he says they don't get married. They volunteer. They volunteer to be part of the sect. That's how they multiply. They do not deny the fitness of marriage. In other words, they're not like anti-all marriage, but they personally guard against lascivious behavior of women and are persuaded that none of them preserve their fidelity to one man. Jeez, that's not very nice. Well, we're not going to dwell on that too much. But there are some Essenes who don't get married because they don't trust the purity of women. So again, it's a purity issue. My internet's a little bad, so if I freeze, please somebody unmute and let me know. All right, the Essenes are despisers of riches, and they're so that raises our admiration. Nor is there anyone to be found among them that has more than another. Why? Because there's a law among them that they have to live in common, right? That's what I was just talking about. So they there's no appearance of poverty or excess. They all have the same amount. They have no city. They have no one city, but many of them dwell in every city. And if anyone visits one other city, right, if they travel from one city to another, they're welcomed into the new city by their own kin, right? So if any of their sect comes from other places, what they have lies open before them, just as if it were their own, kind of like a Chabad house. They go into such as they never knew before, as if they had ever been so long acquainted with them. And as for their piety towards God, it's extraordinary. They never speak a word of profane matters. And that comes up a lot in the legal material of the Dead Sea text, that you are not allowed to waste your language. You're not allowed to ever speak anything profane. Every word has to be weighted and intentional. And actually, there are penalties for speaking unnecessarily at the Dead Sea, in the Dead Sea sect. Okay, and here's their doctrine. Bodies are corruptible, and the matter they are made of is not permanent, but the souls are immortal and continue forever. This was a massive debate among Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes, the relationship between the soul and the body. The Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. They say that the soul dies with the body. And so this is a different attitude towards that. I want to skim down a little bit. Although this is quite poetic language, but I want to go down. And then he says, okay, moreover, there's another order of Essenes who agree with the rest as to their way of living and customs and law, but differ from them in the point of marriage. So again, remember I said that some do marry, some don't, as thinking that by not marrying, they cut off the principal part of the human life, which is the prospect of succession. So there are some Pharisees who do marry. Okay, and then he has a little bit to say about the Pharisees here. The Pharisees are those who are esteemed the most skillful in the exact explication of their laws. And so the Pharisees are not only the ones who are notably claiming to inherit a category called the unwritten law that goes all the way back to Revelation at Sinai, but they're also claiming to be the authoritative interpreters of that unwritten law. And then it's going to be a question of what is the status, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, what is the status of those interpretations? Are they too unwritten law? But in any case, the Pharisees, they're interpreters. They ascribe to all fate or providence and to God, and yet allow that to what is right or the contrary. This is difficult language, but basically elsewhere, Josephus says that that Sadducees believe everything is free will, the Essenes don't believe in free will, and the Pharisees take a moderate approach. All right, that's all I want to do just for concerns of time. The point here is that Josephus goes on and on and on about the Essenes, on the presumption that his readers don't know about them, because there aren't so many, there's just a couple thousand. And many of them don't marry, so they're dependent on volunteers, but their ethos of common living is considered to be very admirable. And we find the same admiration in the writings of Philo, who probably never met an Essene in his entire life. Philo lives in Alexandria in Egypt. He says that he only goes to the temple one time, so he maybe wasn't even in the land of Israel more than once in his life, but he's heard about the Essenes and he admires the Essenes very much. Again, they have a reputation for virtue and brotherly love, so apparently they treat each other better than the Pharisees and the Sadducees treat each other. And because they're dependent on volunteers and many of them don't get married, no Essene is a mere child or newly bearded. The characters of such are unstable with a waywardness, right? You don't have annoying teenagers who are like staying up all night on Instagram and Twitter. You don't have like annoying rebellious youngsters. They're all mature already. They're full grown. Some are verging on old age. And so they enjoy this veritable freedom. None of them has private property. Again, this ethos of common living, Philo's in great admiration of. And they enjoy the benefit of all in common. They live together, formed in clubs, bands of comradeship with common meals. So again, imagine a kibbutz. That is how the Essenes live. Thus, having a common life and a common table, they are content with the same conditions, lovers of frugality who shun expensive luxury as a disease of both body and soul. And here again, he says they don't like marriage because it undermines one's ability to achieve total piety and self-control. Thus, such then is the life of the Essenes, a life so highly to be prized that not only commoners, but also great kings look upon them with admiration and amazement, and the approbation and honors which they give add further veneration to their venerable name. I mean, you can't get higher praise than this from Philo. And even Pliny the Elder, the Roman statesman, the Roman writer, talks about the Essenes. And again, he probably never met an Essene in his life, but they have a reputation. They are known as extraordinarily pious, and they live in common with one another. So those are the Essenes, and they're different. They're distinct from the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who are very integrated into the social, economic, and political lives of the broader Jewish population in the land of Israel. Totally integrated. All right, I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into sectarian law by focusing on laws of Shabbat. But before I do that, are there any questions, thoughts, confusions? Okay, I see a question. Well, I feel bad, Mark, because if I'm going to go into the chat, then I want to answer Joyce first. Hold on a second. I'm surprised the Pharisees were sectarian. All right. So we'll get back to that later if I answered it a little bit, but we could return to that in about 15 minutes. Did the Sadducees reject the elaborate angelology that seems to have sprung fully formed out of nowhere in the Pharisaic tradition? There's a lot of angelology in Qumran as well. There's some really interesting scholarship on this. I would assume the Sadducees did reject it, although there's some interesting stuff about this also in Avot de Rabbi Natan. I would recommend, rather than telling you an answer that probably isn't fully formed, I would recommend the scholarship of Annette Yoshiko Reed, who's written on the question of the causes. Oh, wait, you're very excited. Mark, why are you excited? No, you're muted. You're muted. Yeah.
Mark, just press the invitation to unmute so we can hear you.
Or
There
yeah.
you go. Perfect.
I just bought her book. I came through it through one of the rabbit holes I jumped through thanks to you. So
great.
It's not for the general reader, so I'm struggling with it.
You know what? I don't know if I should say this. It's going on Facebook. It's the writing style is very sophisticated. maybe I would use another word. It's complex. It's sophisticated. So I know. I'm trying to think what else offhand works on the subject. I'm gonna have to think about it and feel free to reach out. Although if you went through a rabbit hole, you've probably seen everything that I've seen. But yeah, I mean, she's
It's just written for scholars, and I'm the general reader, at best.
Me too. But yes, okay. So okay, well, anyway, so yes, let's go to Qumran. All right. There are 4 main legal works produced by the Qumran community, or rather, I should say, are discovered in the caves that comprise the library of the community. Why am I saying it that way? Because we don't always know what was produced within the community and by the sectarians who live there and what was imported. So for example, if you have a book like Jubilees, 15 copies of Jubilees are found in the Dead Sea Caves. This is a sectarian work. It's a highly legal work. There's a lot of legal material, a lot of information about how to observe Shabbat and the holidays, but it is not a work that was likely produced by someone living in that region in Qumran. So we have to be a little careful. So these are 4 major legal works. 2 almost certainly were produced by the sectarian. I mean, I actually will say that all of them likely were produced at the at Qumran itself, but we just have to be careful because we don't always exactly know the provenance of these documents. Anyway, one is known as the Damascus document. It is also found in the Cairo Geniza, so it was well known to scholars even before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and published. One is the community rule, the Serach Hayachad, and both of these documents explore and explicate how the sect should organize itself and live and interact and how they should conduct themselves. And then we have a fascinating work called Miktzat Maaseh Torah, which is a legal text that discusses how to bring certain kinds of sacrifices at the temple, also referred to by scholars as 4QMMT, because it's found in the fourth cave, and MMT, Miktzat Maaseh Torah, and then something called the Temple Scroll. So these are the four major legal works at Qumran. And as I said earlier, the main concern of these writers is to properly separate the forces of good, or the forces that are pure, from evil, impure forces. I think that for reasons of time, we're only going to focus on the Damascus document in the next few minutes, because the laws of Shabbat here are really interesting. I think sometimes we get influenced by a Christian framework in which we think of ritual and ethics as two totally separate and distinct categories. And that is just not the case for Jews in ancient times. And it's absolutely not the case for the Essenes, because they're not thinking about ritual here and ethics there. They're thinking about mixing and separating. And so whether you're separating, again, from a non-Jew, or whether you're separating a certain kind of a impure food, or you're separating vessels that are made with different qualities and different materials, it's about separating what's pure and impure. So it's not helpful, I don't think, to think about this category as ritual, even though a lot of this is going to look ritual to you. So let's look at how this is manifest in its description of Shabbat. Hold on, I'm going to go back. Sorry, I by mistake closed my source sheet. Hold on 1 second. All right, so, but you should have it in front of you. I only updated a tiny bit. Let's see. Okay. All right, so do you see? Oh no, those are my notes. Now you see my secrets. Hold on.
It's also in the chat for anyone
So
who would like.
Okay. All right. So we have a section on purification by water. And then we have a section concerning Shabbat, to observe it according to its law. Okay, so take a look at this. You know what? Just for fun, anybody interested in reading? I don't mind reading it, but it might make it more interesting if we let somebody else. And you can start from the third line. Anyone who wants to read, no man shall speak of a vain or idle word. But I do interrupt. I'm going to read it. Okay. No man shall, what?
It looks like Sarah. Sarah, are you okay
Oh,
reading
Sarah,
it?
great. Yeah,
Sure.
please.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay. No man shall walk more than 2,000 cubits after
Wait
a
a
beast.
second. Where?
I thought that's where you wanted me to start.
Can you start with no man shall speak any vain or idle word?
Okay, sure. No man
Thanks.
shall speak any vain or idle word on the Sabbath day.
Okay, so remember what was described by Josephus as there's no idle talk. And so they're going to be especially strict about this on Shabbat. Okay, keep going.
He shall make no loan to his companion. He shall make no decision in matters of money and gain. He shall say nothing about the work of labor to be done on the morrow.
I think this is fascinating because there's a lot here when it comes to the minutia of how to observe Shabbat that makes its way into later rabbinic literature, and that even that rabbinic literature is not considered mandatory. So this text provides us some kind of legal continuity of how Jews in this climate observed Shabbat. And here I think that this is delightful because as a child, I thought this idea that you don't talk about planning on Shabbat was like a modern, kind of a modern stringency. But the Dead Sea sect was very strict about not talking about what you would do on Sunday. Okay, so keep going.
No man shall walk in the field to do business on the Sabbath. He shall not walk more than 1,000 cubits beyond his town.
Again, this provides us with very interesting continuity because it's only the later rabbis who are discussing the precise parameters of where you can walk and what constitutes the city and what constitutes the field beyond. And so, again, in the 2nd century or maybe the 1st century BCE, these sectarians are already discussing it. I'm trying to think of whether I want you to skip because it's already 12:15 or 1:15. Oh yeah, do keep going. Yeah.
Okay. No man shall eat on the Sabbath day except that which is already prepared.
Okay, that's like basic. I'm sorry, Sarah. You're so gracious that you're letting me cut you off after every sentence. So this is like that's not a surprise, right? You can't cook on the Sabbath. Okay.
He shall eat nothing lying in the fields. He shall not drink except in the camp.
Okay, because now we think this is because of the carrying issue. We're going to see the carrying issue becomes very important. Yeah.
If he's on a journey and goes down to bathe, he shall drink where he stands, but he shall not draw water into a vessel. He shall not send out no stranger on his business on the Sabbath day.
Okay, I want you to skip a little bit.
Okay.
I want you to go down to no man shall take anything out of the house.
Okay. No man shall take anything out of the house or bring anything in. And if he is in a booth, let him neither take anything out or bring anything in.
Okay, now, sorry. Now go to the next line. I want you to tell me what you think it's doing there.
No man shall carry perfumes on himself whilst going coming on the Sabbath.
This is unreal to me. This is one of my favorite sentences in the Damascus document. Why can you not wear perfume if you're a sectarian? If you're a member of the sect, you can't wear perfume. Why?
I guess you're carrying something.
You're carrying. To me, that's like, wow, because I mean, like, who would think? Like, would this ever occur to you that you're carrying?
Well, you carry your clothes when you wear them. Are you supposed to walk around naked on Shabbat? That's ridiculous.
I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, but I guess they were so concerned with modesty that maybe it was okay to put on your clothes, but not okay to do something unnecessary, extraneous, like perfume.
It's almost like every day is Yom Kippur or something.
It's very, very stringent. Okay, why don't we go down? I'm trying to think, because then it segues into cultic laws pertaining to sacrifice. So again, we have this. We've got purification. We've got food, Shabbat, and temple, right? Because really, it's all one thing. It's about producing a system of purity that controls outside forces of evil by avoiding certain illegal mixtures. Okay, you can't eat the larva of bees. There was something else that it says about Gentiles on the Sabbath, and I wanted to find that. But
so you can't mix with them or something.
Oh yeah. Here it is. No man shall spend the Sabbath in a place near Gentiles. So this is, I'm at CTU, I shouldn't be screaming this sentence. This is quite a surprise. I mean, you don't have any kind of legal legislation, as far as I know, in later rabbinic literature. What does it mean to, to be able to like effectively avoid Gentiles on the Sabbath? And in any case, so
we have it reversed though. Somewhere in the Talmud it says that when the Gentiles are having their own holidays, we can't engage in commerce with them for 3 days before because it might be seen as contributing to their holiday.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that the concern there, and I believe it's in Gittin, I think the concern there is that if there's any idolatrous act that's taking place at a celebration, like let's say it's a Gentile wedding or any kind of festival, then there's a fear of implicit legitimization of that idolatrous act, right? So that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So let's skip because we're getting close to the end, and I want you, just on your own time, if you're curious, to take a look at the temple scroll, the community rule, Miktzat Maseh Torah. You'll find a lot of legal material, but again, the concern is purity, and I would recommend you read Furstenberg, and there's some other great scholars on this. But I want to go to the Book of Jubilees. Apologies for this like very, very long source sheet. Okay, so Jubilees, like I said, is a sectarian document, but it is not a document that is in perfect alignment with the sectarian legal texts at Qumran that I discussed: community rule, Damascus document, temple scroll, and 4Q MMT. This comes from a different community, and it's a community that believes that the proper calendar to be observed by Jews is a fully solar calendar. So whoever the author is part of a tiny community, because we don't know of Jews really who are observing a solar calendar. Jews, at least by the rabbinic period, are observing an intercalated lunar calendar, which means that it's a lunar calendar that's not floating along the year, but it's regulated by a leap month so that it could be mapped onto the solar year. And that way, Sukkot will always more or less be in the fall, although everything is late this upcoming fall. And Pesach will always be in the spring because there are these seasonal connections to these holidays, but it's an intercalated lunar calendar, and Jubilees is completely solar. So it's imported from where? Who is the author? We know very, very little. There's some great scholars who've written on this. I would recommend the works of either James Kugel or Michael Siegel. They disagree about exactly when in the 2nd century BC this text is written, and is it a composite of two halves? But for our purposes, the way that I like to talk about Jubilees is this is a person who thinks 99.99% of Jews are eating on Yom Kippur. So when I say a sect, right, I'm not talking about the therapeutic that Philo is, imagining, like studying Homer in the wilderness. I'm imagining people who say, if you're not living according to our views, you are not the true Israel, and you are sinning every day. So it's quite severe. Jubilees is a very serious work. It is a rewriting of Bereshit and the beginning of Shemot all the way up until the revelation at Sinai. And it's very obsessed with calendar. So it has a system of every time it says a week, that means 7 years. And there's a whole like calendrical, I think a week means 7 years, but right now I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly, but it's all like a chronology according to these sets of 7 years. And it contains many midrashic traditions that resurface in the much later rabbinic era, such as the 5th century collection Bereshit Rabbah. So there's some great examples of this. If you look at Bereshit Rabbah, and you'll find the story of Abraham destroying the idols of his father Terach. Well, you'll find actually similar stories in Jubilees, which pushes these traditions 7 centuries earlier. I love things like that. I love finding Aggadic traditions in the Second Temple period that help us to like achieve a more continuous line of interpretation through the centuries. So all of that I'm not going to speak about in the next few minutes because I'm concerned about Shabbat. I'm concerned about the legal material. And Jubilees, I have a lot of stuff on here, a lot of passages that mention various laws, but I want to focus on Shabbat because it frames the book. The beginning and the end of Jubilees talk about Shabbat as being the primary expression of Israel's affirmation of the covenantal relationship. And that makes perfect sense because for the author of Jubilees, it is all about the discipline of the calendar that separates the true Israel from the rest of the world. And this is at a time where there is no 7-day week. And the Romans they're not observing a 7-day week. So the whole idea of Shabbat is totally counterintuitive to your average person in the ancient world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you look for yourself, at Jubilees 2, the 2nd chapter, you'll find a review of the story of creation and the account of God giving Shabbat as a present to Adam and to humanity. And there God says, anyone who does any work, let him surely die forever. So we think that means kind of like kare, like being cut off. It's not normal death. Oh, I see there might be a question. I'll look in a second. And make known that the children of Israel shouldn't prepare anything. They can't cook, right, on the Sabbath. It only has to be done on the 6th day. And I love that because as someone living in 2024, I'm like, oh, this is great. I really shouldn't be preparing for Shabbat on Thursday or Wednesday. I should just start on Friday, like the book of Jubilees told me to. And they shall not bring out, they shall not bring in or take out from house to house on that day, because it's more holy and more blessed than any day of the Jubilee of Jubilees. And so here again, it's almost an exact echo of the Damascus document, where you really can't carry from house to house, from domain to domain. That's an important aspect of work that is forbidden according to the author. Sounds Levitical. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on the ways in which certain laws overlap and diverge with priestly traditions.
It was more just the obsession with the calendar.
Oh, okay, yeah, certainly. Okay, so here at the very end of Jubilees, remember Jubilees is a rewriting of all of Bereshit and then the beginning of Shemot, and then we end with this revelation. And at the revelation, God again returns to this idea of Shabbat being the most emblematic expression of the Jews, of the Israelites' commitment to God. Now, I'm so sorry, but this translation is really bad because with Jubilees 2, I was typing it out, which was very laborious from a good translation that I liked. But then I ran out of time, so I just kind of pasted from the internet, and the internet doesn't have such a good translation, so it's very antiquated. So you'll have to forgive me. 6 days wilt thou labor, but on the seventh day is the Shabbat of your God. You should do no work, you and your sons, right? And this is, of course, basically a quotation from Shemot Chet, great is the honor. But then he continues and expands, great is the honor which the Lord has given to Israel, that they should eat and drink and be satisfied on this festival day and rest from all labor, which belongs to the labor of the children of men, and except for burning incense and bringing oblations and sacrifices, and on and on and on. And then it just keeps going. Any man who does any work or goes on a journey or tills his farm, whether in his house or who lights a fire or rides on any beast and travels by ship and strikes or kills anything or slaughters a beast or a bird or catches an animal or bird or a fish or fasts or makes war. And remember, we saw last week that question of should you fight on Shabbat? The man who does any of these things shall die. This is the most extensive, or one of the most extensive, detailed lists of prohibitions of what it's by no means the 39 melachot, but it's one of the most detailed lists that we have of what was forbidden, what was considered forbidden for Jews on the Sabbath. And of course, the notion that you cannot make war on Shabbat, according to, under any circumstance, again, undermines what we find in 1 Maccabees. Remember when Judah and his brothers critique those who do not fight back on the Sabbath, even though it would mean violating that holy day. So I think I'm going to stop there. What are the main ideas that I want to convey in this short hour? Is that when we talk about common Judaism, I think that's important. I think it's important to remember most Jews are not in a sect, but that scheme of Shabbat, Brit Milah, dietary law does not quite work when we're talking about the sectarian community, which is highly concerned with preserving purity. Now, exactly how they conceive of purity and what they're mandating of their community differs from community to community, with the Pharisees, according to Furstenberg and others, actually being much more lenient than the Essenes, because the Pharisees empower themselves to assess and often to bypass forces that others thought were impure. And the Essenes are much more stringent. All right, in our remaining couple minutes, are there any questions? Or I could talk about next week. Yeah, Talia.
I have a question. I'm just curious about how these sectarian groups started, when and how. Do we have any idea sort of how it transitioned from I don't know, whenever we think they started until you get these really intense divides?
Yeah, I would recommend Al Baumgarten wrote a classic. I mean, it must be 40 years already now that he wrote his classic work on sectarianism. I don't remember the title of it, but there's broad consensus in light of his scholarship and others that this was a response to the perception that the temple in Jerusalem had been violated not merely by the Syrian Greek enemy, but by Hellenized and unfaithful Jews. And so we read in 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees figures like Jason and Menelaus. These are Hellenized Jews who are allowing the temple to be desecrated. And there's such a sense of corruption that Jews are reacting in a very extreme way, and basically saying the temple is defiled. And now we need, or this is at least the case of the Qumran community, now we're going to retreat up until the time that God will actively intervene and restore the temple to its original glory. But until that time, we do not consider the temple to be the legitimate locus of our cultic worship. Now, we actually have really interesting material from Qumran called the Pesher, the Pesharim. The Pesharim are interpretations of prophetic books, mostly in the minor prophets like Pesher Habakkuk. And these are interpretations of parts of Tanakh, prophetic parts of Tanakh, that interpret that literature in light of the sect's origins. So Pesher, the author of Pesher Habakkuk, will cite a line from Habakkuk and then say, this refers to the evil priest who oppressed our righteous teacher. And, no one is named. It's all like very opaque. But this refers to, the teacher of righteousness who was expelled from the temple. And so we have these pisharim, which are fascinating and suggest that there was a major clash between the founders of the Qumran community and administrators of the temple who may have been Sadducees. But again, a lot of this is clouded in history, and we don't know for sure exactly. But that it seems to be in the 180s and 170s BCE.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
What percentage of the population were these sects? I mean, at least in Israel or, in Egypt.
Yeah, I think I might have discussed this in the first week, but maybe I didn't. So Josephus says there's 6,000 Essenes, 6,000 Pharisees, 4,000 Essenes, and 3,000 Sadducees. So if a conservative estimate of Judean population is 600,000 to 800,000 people in Judea, and maybe, the Galilee as well, maybe up to 800,000. And then there are up to 1 million Jews in Egypt by the 1st century, at least according to Philo, but easily 500,000 Jews in Egypt. And then you have Jews still in Eastern lands. And then you have Jews to the north in Antioch, and you have Jews in Greek islands, and you have Jews in Rome. First of all, it's clear that the majority of Jews are not in the land of Israel by the 1st century, even though there's a very important, I would say, robust, active community of Jews in the land of Israel, but certainly there's many things going on elsewhere. So you do the math. If, let's say, there's 2.5 million Jews in the world, and I think that there might have even been more, but again, these are very rough, and you could look at the scholarship of Selo Baron. I know I have to finish up, so I'm speaking quickly. But so there are scholars like Selo Baron who've tried to estimate this number, but the bottom line is this is a tiny percentage, these sectarians. But if Josephus is right, that they have outsized influence, right? Sadducees are part of the priestly administrators of the temple, and Pharisees are teachers. So you're dealing with people who have high public profiles, at least with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, less so with the Essenes. I think I have to wrap up, but I'm looking forward to picking this up next week. Yes, thank you very much. And we'll talk about the temple and pilgrimage next week.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Simkovich, and thank you everyone else who participated today. We love having you as part of our learning community here at Drisha. Just a reminder that Sfira Zman continues with classes meeting Sunday through Thursday in the mornings, afternoon, and evenings. Highlights coming up include Talmud, comparative that word give me trouble every week. Methodologies, of study on Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. with Rabbi Shmuel Hain, I believe that's how you pronounce. And you can find information about the classes without my accent at drisha.org/classes, and hope to see you there. Lehitraot, everyone. Bye.